The crystalline towers of Valdris pierced the morning mist like ancient spears, their surfaces catching the first rays of sunlight and scattering rainbows across the cobblestone courtyard below. Prince Kael Drakemore stood at the highest balcony of the royal citadel, his powerful frame silhouetted against the awakening kingdom, the scent of mountain roses and fresh snow carried on the wind. But beneath it all lingered something that made his alpha instincts restless. Change was coming. "Your Highness," came the measured voice of Commander Theron, his most trusted advisor. "The council awaits your presence in the Moonstone Hall." Kael's jaw tightened, his steel-grey eyes never leaving the horizon where the whispering mountains met the endless sky. At 28, he had already earned the respect of every warrior in the kingdom, his reputation as an unconquerable alpha preceding him into battle. Yet here, within these familiar walls, he felt more trapped than he ever had facing enemy armies. "Let me guess," Kael said, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who had shouted commands across battlefields. "Another proposal of marriage, another Omega from a noble house, perfectly bred and trained to produce the next generation of royal heirs." Theron shifted uncomfortably behind him. The commander had known Kael since childhood, had watched him transform from a laughing prince into the stone-faced man who now carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. "The Lady Celeste of House Silvermoon has arrived from the eastern provinces. Her family's dowry would secure our trade routes for generations. And she's an Omega," Kael stated flatly. "A pure-blooded Omega from one of the oldest bloodlines in Valdris." Kael finally turned, and Theron had to suppress a step backward. The prince's eyes held a coldness that seemed to freeze the very air between them. 3 years had passed since the massacre at Ironhold, since Kael had lost everything that mattered to him in a single night of betrayal and blood. The laughing prince who once embraced his role as future king had died in those ruins, leaving behind a man who rejected every bond, every connection that might lead to such devastating loss again. "Tell the council I'll be there shortly," Kael said, moving past Theron with the fluid grace of a predator. "And, Commander—" "Yes, Your Highness. Prepare my horse. After this charade, I'm going hunting." The Moonstone Hall lived up to its name, its walls embedded with thousands of tiny crystals that caught and reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. Today, however, the beauty was lost on Kael as he entered to find the full council of lords assembled around the crescent-shaped table, their faces bearing expressions ranging from hopeful to calculating. At the center of their attention sat Lady Celeste, and Kael had to admit she was everything an alpha was supposed to desire in an Omega. Golden hair cascaded down her shoulders like spun silk, her emerald eyes were perfectly demure, and her posture spoke of years of careful training in royal etiquette. She was beautiful, refined, and utterly forgettable. "Your Highness," Lord Aldrich, the council's eldest member, rose with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I present Lady Celeste of House Silvermoon?" Celeste rose gracefully, offering a curtsy that displayed just enough deference without appearing subservient. "It is my honor to meet you, Prince Kael. I have heard tales of your victories that have reached even our distant provinces." Her voice was pleasant, melodious even, but it stirred nothing in Kael's chest. No quickening of his pulse, no stirring of his alpha instincts, nothing but the same hollow indifference that had greeted every potential mate for the past 3 years. "Lady Celeste," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Indeed, Your Highness. The roads through the Silverwood are particularly beautiful this time of year." The conversation continued in the predictable patterns of court formality, but Kael's mind wandered to the mountains beyond the city walls. Out there, the world was honest. Predators hunted prey, the strong protected the weak, and bonds were formed through genuine connection rather than political necessity. Here, surrounded by the careful smiles and calculating gazes of nobles, everything felt false. "Perhaps," Lord Aldrich suggested with poorly concealed eagerness, "Your Highness would honor Lady Celeste with a tour of the royal gardens." "I'm afraid I have pressing matters that require my attention," Kael replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Perhaps another time." The disappointment in the room was palpable, but Kael had long since stopped caring about the feelings of politicians and social climbers. He had learned the hard way that caring too much, trusting too deeply, led only to ashes and regret. As he strode from the hall, ignoring the whispered conversations that erupted in his wake, Kael caught a scent on the air that made him pause. It was faint, almost lost among the heavy perfumes and polished leather of the court, but there was something wild about it, something untamed that spoke to the deepest parts of his alpha nature. He turned, scanning the assembled nobles, but saw nothing out of place. Lady Celeste was still seated at the table, accepting sympathetic words from the other ladies. The lords were deep in urgent discussion about trade agreements and political alliances. Everything appeared normal, yet that scent lingered, promising something his rational mind insisted couldn't exist, a genuine connection in a world built on careful facades. Chapter 2. The Scent of Destiny. The Thornwood stretched for miles beyond the city walls of Valdris, its ancient trees creating a canopy so thick that even midday felt like twilight beneath their branches. Kyle urged his black stallion Shadowfang deeper into the forest, seeking the silence that only the wild places could provide. Here, away from the suffocating expectations of court, he could finally breathe. The rhythmic thunder of hooves on forest floor gradually slowed as Kyle guided Shadowfang to a halt beside the Crystal Falls, a hidden waterfall that had been his refuge since childhood. The sound of cascading water over smooth stones filled the air, washing away the echoes of disappointed nobles and political maneuvering that had followed him from the citadel. He dismounted with fluid grace, his alpha senses immediately cataloguing every sight, sound, and scent of his surroundings. 3 deer grazing in a meadow beyond the tree line, a family of foxes denning somewhere to the north, the sharp, clean scent of mountain snow carried on the wind. Everything was as it should be, except for that scent. Kyle froze, his nostrils flaring as he caught the same wild fragrance that had teased him in the Moonstone Hall. But here, away from the competing aromas of court, it was stronger, clearer. Pine needles and wildflowers, with an underlying warmth that made his alpha instinct stir for the first time in years. It was Omega, but unlike any Omega scent he had ever encountered. There was no artificial sweetness, no cloying perfume designed to attract. This was raw, natural, and utterly intoxicating. Moving with the silent precision of a hunter, Kyle followed the scent trail deeper into the forest. His heart rate increased with each step, though he told himself it was merely curiosity. He had trained himself to ignore the mating bonds, to suppress the alpha drive that demanded he seek out the perfect Omega. Yet something about this scent bypassed every defense he had carefully constructed. The trail led to a small clearing where wildflowers grew in impossible abundance, their colors more vibrant than anything in the royal gardens. And there, kneeling beside a stream that fed into the Crystal Falls, was the source of the scent that had driven him from his throne room into the depths of the forest. She was nothing like Lady Celeste. Auburn hair tumbled loose around her shoulders, catching fire in the scattered beams of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. Her clothes were simple, leather breeches, and a forest green tunic that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. She moved with an unconscious grace as she filled a water skin from the stream, completely unaware of his presence. When she finally looked up, Kyle felt the world shift beneath his feet. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of silver that seemed to hold lightning. But it wasn't their color that stopped his breath. It was the intelligence in them, the fierce independence that blazed like a beacon. This was no carefully trained court Omega, bred for submission and political advantage. This was something wild and untamed, a creature of the forest who moved through the world on her own terms. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice carrying none of the musical artifice he was accustomed to hearing from noble ladies. It was husky, real, with an edge that suggested she was perfectly capable of defending herself despite her Omega status. "These are royal lands," Kyle replied, stepping into the clearing with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged. "If anyone is trespassing, it would be you." She stood slowly, and he was surprised by her height. Most Omegas were petite, delicate creatures who made alphas feel protective and dominant. This woman met his gaze directly, unflinching, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that sent heat rushing through his veins. "Royal lands," she repeated, her tone suggesting she found the concept amusing. "And you are?" For a moment, Kyle was speechless. When was the last time someone had asked his identity? In court, everyone knew exactly who he was from the moment he entered a room. His presence commanded immediate respect, fearful deference, careful calculation. This woman looked at him as if he were simply another person sharing her forest. "Kyle," he said finally, deciding not to reveal his title. There was something refreshing about being seen as just a man rather than a prince. "Arya," she replied, bending to retrieve her water skin, "and these may be royal lands on some dusty map in a castle somewhere, but the forest doesn't recognize human ownership. It belongs to itself." Her words should have offended him. He was the heir to a kingdom, a man whose word was law, whose authority was absolute. Instead, he found himself intrigued by her perspective, by the way she moved through the world, as if it owed her nothing and she owed it nothing in return. "You have an interesting philosophy," Kyle said, moving closer to the stream. "Do you make a habit of poaching on royal preserves?" Arya's laugh was like silver bells in the wind, completely natural and utterly enchanting. "Poaching? I was collecting water from a stream. Last I checked, even kings hadn't figured out how to own running water." The scent of her was stronger now, wrapping around him like a physical presence. His alpha instincts roared to life, demanding that he claim her, mark her, bind her to him with bonds that could never be broken. But there was something else, something deeper than mere biological imperative. For the first time in 3 years, he felt truly alive. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked, genuinely curious. "It's dangerous for an Omega to wander the deep forest without protection." Something flickered in her storm-grey eyes. Anger, perhaps, or frustration. "I don't need protection. I've been taking care of myself in these woods longer than you've probably been alive." She looked to be in her early 20s, which would make her statement mathematically impossible, but there was something ancient in her eyes, a depth of experience that seemed to contradict her apparent youth. Kale found himself wanting to know her story, to understand what had shaped this fierce, independent creature who challenged him with every word. "Everyone needs protection sometimes," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "Do they?" Arya shouldered her pack and turned to face him fully. "And what about you, Kyle? What are you hiding from in these woods?" The question hit him like a physical blow. She saw through him as easily as sunlight through crystal, recognizing the pain he kept buried beneath layers of duty and royal composure. No one had asked him such a direct question in years. No one had dared. "I'm not hiding," he said. But even to his own ears the words sounded false. "No?" Arya tilted her head, studying him with uncomfortable intensity. "Then what do you call it when a man flees from his own throne room to seek solitude in the wilderness?" Before he could formulate a response, she was moving past him, heading back toward the deeper forest, with the easy confidence of someone who knew every tree and stone. The scent of her lingered in her wake, tormenting him with possibilities he had sworn to never consider again. "Wait," he called out, surprising himself. She paused, but didn't turn around. "Yes? Will you be here tomorrow?" For a long moment silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the waterfall and the whisper of wind through leaves. Then, without looking back, she replied, "The forest will be here tomorrow. Whether I am or not depends entirely on whether it wants me to be." And then she was gone, disappearing into the shadows between the trees, as if she had never existed at all. Kyle stood alone in the clearing, his alpha instincts screaming at him to follow, to pursue, to claim what was his. But deep in his chest, in a place that had been frozen for 3 years, something warm and dangerous began to stir. For the first time since the massacre at Ironhold, Prince Kale Drakemore wanted something more than solitude. Chapter 3. Secrets in Moonlight. The royal dining hall stretched before Prince Kale like a stage set for political theatre, its vaulted ceilings adorned with tapestries depicting the great victories of House Drakemore. Tonight, however, the grandeur felt oppressive as he sat through yet another formal dinner designed to showcase Lady Celeste's virtues as a potential bride. The Omega sat to his right, her conversation perfectly pleasant and utterly forgettable, while the council members watched their every interaction with barely concealed anticipation. "The autumn harvest in the eastern provinces has been particularly bountiful this year," Celeste was saying, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who had been coached in appropriate dinner conversation. "Our grain stores could supplement Valdris's reserves through the winter months." "Ah, how fortunate," Kyle replied mechanically, cutting his roasted venison with more force than necessary. His mind wasn't on trade negotiations or harvest yields. Instead, he found himself remembering storm-grey eyes and the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. 3 days had passed since his encounter with Arya in the forest, and despite his attempts to focus on royal duties, she haunted his thoughts like a half-remembered dream. "Your Highness seems distracted tonight. Lord Aldrich observed from across the table, his keen eyes missing nothing. Perhaps the weight of recent decisions weighs heavily on your mind. Kyle looked up sharply, recognizing the subtle probe. The old lord was fishing for information about his intentions toward Lady Celeste, trying to gauge whether the carefully orchestrated courtship was proceeding as planned. The other council members leaned forward slightly, their interest poorly concealed. "My mind is on the security of our borders," Kyle said, which was partially true. Reports had been coming in from the frontier provinces of increased activity from rival kingdoms, though nothing yet rose to the level of direct threat. The northern clans have been unusually quiet lately. In my experience, quiet enemies are often the most dangerous. Indeed, Commander Theron agreed from his position at the far end of the table. Our scouts report strange movements in the Shadowlands. Refugees fleeing south speak of armies gathering in the darkness beyond the Barrier Mountains. The mention of the Shadowlands cast a pall over the dinner conversation. Those cursed territories had been abandoned for generations after the Great Corruption, leaving them as a wasteland where few dared to venture. If forces were indeed gathering there, it could spell disaster for all the civilized kingdoms. Perhaps, Lady Celeste interjected delicately, such troubling matters are better discussed in the war room than at dinner. Her words were diplomatically phrased, but Kyle caught the underlying message. Proper ladies shouldn't be exposed to talk of war and violence. It was exactly the kind of response he had come to expect from court-bred Omegas, and it irritated him more than it should have. He found himself comparing it to Arya's direct questions about what he was hiding from, her fearless engagement with topics most would consider inappropriate. "You're quite right, Lady Celeste," Lord Aldrich said smoothly. "Forgive us for allowing such dark subjects to intrude upon such pleasant company." The conversation turned to safer topics: art, music, the upcoming Harvest Festival, but Kale's attention continued to wander. When the dessert course was finally served, he found himself calculating how quickly he could escape without causing a diplomatic incident. "If you'll excuse me," he said, rising from his chair, "I have correspondence that requires my immediate attention." The disappointment on Lady Celeste's face was subtle but unmistakable. She had clearly been hoping for more time to demonstrate her suitability as a mate, perhaps even a private moment, where they might begin to explore the possibility of a mating bond. Instead, she offered a gracious smile and a perfectly appropriate curtsy. "Of course, Your Highness. Duty must always come first." As Kale strode from the dining hall, he caught a fragment of whispered conversation between two of the younger lords. 3 years since the prince has shown interest in any Omega. Kingdom needs an heir, especially with the Shadowlands stirring. Starting to wonder if the rumors about Ironhold damaged more than just... Kale's stride lengthened, his jaw clenching at the half-heard speculation. The rumors about Ironhold. He knew what they whispered in the darker corners of the court, theories about why he had survived when everyone he loved had perished. Some suggested cowardice. Others hinted at darker bargains made in desperation. None dared speak such accusations openly, but the whispers followed him like shadows. Instead of returning to his chambers, Kale found himself climbing the winding stairs to the highest tower of the citadel. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of approaching winter. Below him, the lights of Valdris twinkled like earthbound stars, while above, the real stars wheeled in their eternal dance across the velvet sky. He had come here often as a child, when the weight of royal expectations felt too heavy to bear. His father had found him here once, after a particularly difficult lesson with the swordmaster, and instead of scolding him for shirking his duties, King Aldwin had sat beside his son and pointed out the constellations. "Do you see Dracon's crown?" his father had asked, indicating a cluster of bright stars near the horizon. "The legend says it was placed there by the first Alpha King, as a reminder that even the mightiest rulers are subject to forces greater than themselves." "What forces, father?" "Love, my son. Honor, the bonds that tie us to others. A king who rules only through strength will find his kingdom built on sand, but a king who understands the power of connection, of genuine bonds, his kingdom will endure for generations." The memory brought a familiar ache to Kale's chest. His father had understood the importance of bonds, had ruled through a combination of strength and genuine care for his people, but Aldwin had died before he could see his son's disastrous attempt to follow that philosophy, before Ironhold had taught Kale that bonds were weaknesses to be exploited by enemies. A sound from the gardens below caught his attention, the soft whisper of movement through the shadows. His alpha senses sharpened, cataloguing the intruder's scent before his mind could fully process what he was detecting. Pine needles and wildflowers. Kale's heart rate spiked as he peered down at the royal gardens, searching the maze of carefully manicured hedges and flower beds. There, a flash of auburn hair in the moonlight, moving with the fluid grace he remembered from the forest clearing. Arya was in his gardens. Without conscious thought, he was moving, taking the stairs 3 at a time as he raced toward the ground level. His pulse hammered in his ears, a mix of excitement and concern driving him forward. What was she doing here? How had she penetrated the palace security? And why did some primitive part of him rejoice at her presence, even as his rational mind catalogued the potential dangers? He found her beside the Moonwell, the ancient spring that had given the palace its name. She knelt beside the silvered water, her reflection wavering in the gentle current. In the moonlight she looked ethereal, like some forest spirit who had wandered into the mortal realm by accident. "You're trespassing again," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up without surprise, as if she had sensed his approach long before he spoke. "Am I? I was told this was a place where anyone could come to make offerings to the old gods." "That tradition ended generations ago," Kale replied, stepping closer. "Now it's part of the private royal gardens." "How sad," Arya said, turning back to the water. "The old gods don't recognize the authority of kings any more than the forest does." Her words should have been treasonous, but spoken in her husky voice under the star-filled sky, they sounded like simple truth. Kyle found himself sitting on the stone bench beside the well, drawn by forces he didn't fully understand. "What are you really doing here, Arya?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers trailing in the cool water. When she spoke, her voice held a weight that seemed to contradict her youthful appearance. "I came to see if the rumors were true. They say the prince has forgotten how to feel, that his heart turned to stone after some great tragedy. I wanted to see this legendary alpha who rejects all bonds." "And what have you concluded?" Arya turned to face him fully, those storm-grey eyes seeming to peer directly into his soul. "I think you're the loneliest person I've ever met, and I think you're terrified that if you allow yourself to care again, you'll lose everything that matters." Her words hit him like physical blows, stripping away the carefully constructed armor he wore in court. No one spoke to him with such directness, such unflinching honesty. It was dangerous and exhilarating, and absolutely terrifying. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but even to his own ears, the protest sounded weak. "Don't I?" Arya reached out, her fingertips barely brushing against his hand, where it rested on the stone bench. The contact sent electricity racing up his arm, his alpha instincts roaring to life. "I know you come to the forest when the weight of your crown becomes too heavy to bear. I know you're fighting a war against your own nature, denying bonds that could make you stronger, and I know that whatever happened at Ironhold still haunts your dreams." Kyle jerked his hand away, as if her touch had burned him. "How do you know about Ironhold?" "Stories travel, even to the deep forest. The massacre that claimed the prince's betrothed and her entire family, the political alliance that died in blood and fire, the alpha who survived when everyone he loved did not." "Stop." The word came out as a growl, his alpha nature responding to the pain her words evoked. "You know nothing about what happened that night." "Then tell me," Arya said simply. "Tell me what turned the laughing prince into the stone-hearted king." For a heartbeat, Kyle almost did. The words pressed against his lips like caged birds desperate for freedom. The whole truth about Ironhold, about the betrayal that had cost him everything, about the guilt that ate at him like acid every waking moment. But then his training reasserted itself, the walls he had built slamming back into place. "I think you should leave," he said, rising from the bench. "Palace security will be making their rounds soon." Arya stood as well, but she made no move to retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, could lose himself in the intoxicating scent that made his alpha instincts sing with want. "Running away again?" she asked quietly. "I don't run." "No?" Her hand rose to rest against his chest, directly over his heart. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, her touch seemed to burn straight through to his soul. "Then what do you call it, when you flee from every genuine connection, every possibility of real bond?" Kyle's self-control was hanging by the thinnest of threads. Every instinct screamed at him to pull her closer, to bury his face in her neck and breathe in that wild scent until it replaced the emptiness in his chest. To claim her, mark her, make her his in ways that went beyond politics and duty. Instead, he stepped back, putting distance between them before he did something they would both regret. Go home, Arya. Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here. She studied his face for a long moment, and he saw something that might have been disappointment flicker in her eyes. Then she nodded, stepping back toward the shadows. Perhaps you're right, she said. Perhaps the prince really is dead, and all that remains is the crown. She melted back into the darkness as silently as she had appeared, leaving Kyle alone with the Moonwell and the echo of her words. He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had vanished, his chest tight with emotions he refused to name. Chapter 4. The hunt begins. Dawn broke grey and cold over Valdris, matching Cale's mood as he stood in the courtyard, watching the organized chaos of a royal hunting party's preparation. Servants scurried back and forth, loading supplies onto pack horses, while the stable boys readied the mounts for the day's expedition. The traditional autumn hunt was a political necessity as much as entertainment, providing opportunities for the king and his nobles to conduct business away from the formal constraints of court. Lord Aldrich approached, already dressed in his hunting leathers despite the early hour. Your Highness, the party is nearly ready to depart. Lady Celeste has expressed great excitement about joining the hunt. Apparently she's quite skilled with a bow. Has she? Kyle replied without enthusiasm. He had hoped the hunting party would provide a respite from the constant pressure to court the Eastern Province Omega, but it seemed even the wilderness wouldn't offer him escape from matchmaking schemes. Indeed, her father boasts that she once brought down a 12-point stag with a single arrow. Lord Aldrich's tone suggested he found this claim impressive rather than improbable. Kyle nodded absently, his attention caught by a commotion near the main gates. Commander Theron was speaking intently with one of the border scouts, a man whose horse bore the lather of a hard ride through the night. Even from a distance, Kyle could read the tension in both men's postures. "Excuse me," he told Lord Aldrich, striding toward the gates with purposeful steps. "At least 3 separate incursions along the Thornwood border," the scout was saying as Kale approached. "Small groups, moving fast and quiet. They vanish back into the deep forest before our patrols can intercept them." "Any idea who they are?" Theron asked grimly. "That's the strange part, Commander. They don't match any known faction. The tracks suggest they're barefoot, moving like they know every tree and stone in those woods. Almost like what?" Kyle interrupted, joining the conversation. The scout straightened immediately upon recognizing the prince. "Your Highness, I was just reporting unusual activity along our eastern borders. The intruders move through the forest like natives, but they're not from any of the local villages." A chill ran down Cale's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The Thornwood, the same forest where he had met Arya, the forest she claimed to know better than he had been alive, where she moved with uncanny grace and confidence. "What's your assessment, Commander?" Kyle asked, though his mind was already racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. Could be scouts from the northern clans, testing our defenses, or refugees from whatever's stirring in the Shadowlands. Without more information, it's difficult to determine their intentions. "Double the border patrols," Kyle ordered. "I want to know immediately if there are any further incursions. And compile a detailed report of every sighting. Times, locations, numbers observed." "Yes, Your Highness." As the scout departed to relay his orders, Kyle found himself staring eastward toward the forest that had become the center of his confusion. Was it coincidence that mysterious intruders were moving through the same woods where he had encountered the most intriguing Omega of his life? His rational mind insisted it had to be, but his instincts whispered otherwise. "Your Highness," Lady Celeste's melodious voice interrupted his brooding. She approached on a dainty white mare, her hunting outfit perfectly tailored and completely impractical for actual wilderness travel. "I hope the morning's reports haven't brought troubling news." "Nothing that need concern you, Lady Celeste," Kyle replied diplomatically, mounting Shadowfang with fluid ease. "Are you ready for the hunt?" "Quite ready," she said with a bright smile. "I confess I'm eager to see the famous Thornwood. They say it's one of the most beautiful forests in all the realm." Kyle's hands tightened on his reins. Of course the hunt would take them into the Thornwood. The traditional route had been established generations ago, following game trails that led deep into the forest, where the deer were fattest and the wild boar most challenging. Any other day, he would have welcomed the familiar paths and ancient trees. Today, the prospect filled him with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The hunting party consisted of a dozen nobles, their guards, and the necessary servants, enough people to ensure that any encounter with mysterious forest dwellers would be well witnessed and thoroughly political. Lord Aldrich rode near the front with the other senior council members, while Lady Celeste had positioned herself strategically near Chaol, close enough for conversation, but not so close as to appear forward. As they entered the forest, Kyle felt the familiar peace of the wilderness begin to settle over him, though it was complicated now by hyper-awareness of every scent on the wind, every shadow between the trees. His alpha senses were on high alert, searching for any trace of pine needles and wildflowers that might indicate Arya's presence. "The Thornwood is even more magnificent than I imagined," Lady Celeste commented, as they followed a well-worn deer trail deeper into the forest. "One can see why the ancient kings chose to preserve it as royal hunting grounds. The forest preserves itself," Kyle found himself saying, echoing Arya's words from their first meeting. "We merely try not to destroy what we cannot replace." Lady Celeste laughed prettily. "Your Highness has such a poetic way of speaking. Do you write verse as well as lead armies?" Before Chaol could formulate a response to that unexpected question, Lord Marcus, one of the younger nobles, called out from ahead, "Your Highness, the hounds have caught a scent." The hunting dogs, sleek coursers bred for speed and endurance, had indeed found something. Their excited baying echoed through the trees as they pulled against their handlers' leashes, noses to the ground as they followed a trail only they could detect. "What do they have?" Kyle asked, urging Shadowfang forward. "Wild boar, by the look of it," replied Master Aldwyn, the royal huntsman. "A big one, from the depth of the tracks. This should provide excellent sport." The hunt was on. The party spread out according to traditional formation, with the nobles taking positions along likely escape routes, while the hounds and their handlers drove the quarry toward them. Kyle found himself posted at a clearing where several game trails converged, his bow ready and his senses alert. But as he waited in the dappled shadows, his attention was caught not by sounds of approaching boar, but by something else entirely. A figure moved through the trees with impossible stealth, keeping pace with the hunting party, but staying just beyond clear sight. Kyle's alpha instincts prickled with recognition, even before he caught the familiar scent on the wind. Arya was out there, watching them. The rational part of his mind wondered if she was one of the mysterious intruders the border scout had reported. The possibility should have alarmed him, should have made him call out for the guards. Instead, he found himself slipping away from his assigned position, following the whisper of movement through the undergrowth. He tracked her for nearly a mile, his hunter's skills tested against her intimate knowledge of the forest. She led him away from the hunting party, deeper into the thornwood where the trees grew older and thicker, where the very air seemed to hum with ancient power. Finally, in a grove where massive oaks formed a natural cathedral, she stopped and turned to face him. "You're supposed to be hunting boar," Arya said, her storm-grey eyes holding a mixture of amusement and something deeper. "I am hunting," Chaol replied, dismounting from Shadowfang and approaching her on foot. Just not what everyone expects. She was dressed differently today, leather armor that looked both practical and ceremonial, with intricate designs tooled into the surface that seemed to shift and move in the filtered sunlight. Her auburn hair was braided with small bones and feathers, giving her a wild primal appearance that made his alpha nature respond with uncomfortable intensity. "Dangerous words, Your Highness," she said, and his heart nearly stopped at her use of his title. "You know who I am. I've always known who you are, Chaol Drakemore. The question is whether you know who I am." Before he could ask what she meant, the sound of horns echoed through the forest, not the triumphant call that signaled a successful hunt, but the sharp, urgent blast that meant danger. Kyle's training took over, his hand automatically going to his sword as he turned toward the sound. "The hunting party," he began, but when he looked back, Arya was gone. "Damn," he muttered, remounting Shadowfang and urging the stallion toward the horn calls. Whatever was happening, he needed to get back to his people. But as he rode through the ancient trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, that the careful balance he had maintained for 3 years was about to be shattered completely. Behind him, hidden in the shadows of the oak grove, Arya watched him go. Her hand moved to the pendant at her throat, a piece of carved moonstone that pulsed with inner light. "It's time," she whispered to the forest. "The bonds that were broken must be rewoven, no matter the cost." The trees seemed to whisper back their agreement, and somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl. Chapter 5. Blood in the Forest. Kyle rode hard through the thornwood, Shadowfang's hooves thundering against the forest floor as the urgent horn calls grew louder. The sound came from the northeast, where Lord Marcus had been positioned with Lady Celeste and her guard. His alpha instincts screamed danger, every sense heightened as he navigated the dense undergrowth toward the source of the alarm. He found them in a clearing where the morning's hunt had taken a deadly turn. Lord Marcus lay motionless against the base of an ancient pine, his hunting leathers torn and bloody. Lady Celeste knelt beside him, her face pale but determined, as she pressed a cloth against a deep gash in his shoulder. Her white mare stood nearby, its eyes rolling with terror at the scent of blood and something else, something wild and predatory that made even Shadowfang snort uneasily. "What happened?" Kyle demanded, dismounting and drawing his sword in one fluid motion. "We were attacked," Lady Celeste said, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "3 of them, moving like nothing I've ever seen. They came out of nowhere. Commander Theron arrived with a contingent of guards, their weapons drawn as they formed a protective perimeter around the clearing. Your Highness, are you injured?" "I'm fine. See to Lord Marcus." Kyle knelt beside the fallen noble, checking his pulse and assessing his wounds. Marcus was alive but unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. "What did they look like?" "Not entirely human," Lady Celeste replied, her omega scent carrying undertones of fear and adrenaline that made Kale's protective instincts flare. They were tall, lean, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Their movements were too fast, too fluid, and they smelled of wild places, pine and moss and something darker. Kyle's blood ran cold. The description was uncomfortably close to how he might describe Arya, though the violence didn't match the woman who had spoken to him of bonds and healing. Still, the coincidence was too significant to ignore. Did they say anything? Make any demands? They spoke, but not in any language I recognized. It sounded ancient, primal, like the wind through stone caverns. Lady Celeste's hands shook slightly as she continued tending to Marcus's wounds, but her voice remained controlled. They seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Commander Theron crouched beside one of the trees, where claw marks scored the bark in parallel lines too long and deep to have been made by any natural animal. "Your Highness, these markings, I've seen similar ones in the old archives. From the time before the Barrier Mountains were sealed." The implications sent a chill through Kale's bones. The Barrier Mountains had been sealed for over 2 centuries, warded against the corrupted creatures that had emerged during the Great Catastrophe. If something was breaking through those ancient protections, it could mean disaster for all the civilized kingdoms. "We need to get Lord Marcus back to the palace immediately," Kyle ordered. "Send word ahead to prepare the healers, and double the guard. If these creatures are still in the area, I want everyone protected." As the guards prepared to transport the wounded noble, Lady Celeste approached Kale with hesitant steps. "Your Highness, there's something else. During the attack, I heard one of them speak a single word in the common tongue." "What word?" "Drakemore. They were looking for you." The revelation hit Kale like a physical blow. Whatever had attacked the hunting party hadn't been random forest bandits, or even creatures driven mad by corruption. They had been specifically seeking him, the heir to the throne of Valdris. But why? And how did their presence connect to Arya's mysterious appearances? "We return to the palace immediately," he decided. "No one travels alone, and everyone stays within the guard perimeter." As the hunting party regrouped for the journey back to civilization, Kyle found himself scanning the forest shadows for any sign of auburn hair or storm-gray eyes. Part of him hoped to see Arya again, to demand answers about the attack and her possible connection to it. Another part feared what those answers might reveal about the woman who had awakened feelings he thought buried forever. The ride back to Valdris passed without incident, though Kyle noticed his guards casting nervous glances at every shadow between the trees. By the time they reached the palace gates, word of the attack had already spread. King Aldwin himself waited in the courtyard, his weathered face grim with concern. "Kyle," his father said as the prince dismounted, "I've heard troubling reports. Are you injured?" "I'm fine, father, but we need to talk privately." Kyle glanced around at the assembled nobles and servants. There are implications to this attack that go beyond simple banditry. An hour later, Kale sat in his father's private study, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort as he recounted the morning's events. King Aldwin listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. Creatures that move like spirits through the forest, seeking you specifically, the king mused when Kale finished his account. And you say Lady Celeste described their eyes as reflecting light. Like an animal's, she said. Father, what aren't you telling me about the Barrier Mountains? Aldwin was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped before him on the ancient oak desk. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old secrets. There are things about our family's history that I had hoped never to burden you with, my son. Powers and responsibilities that died with your grandfather's generation. But if the old enemies are stirring again, what powers? What enemies? The Drakemore line carries more than just the right to rule, Kyle. We are the last of the Ward Keepers, bound by ancient oaths to protect the realm from forces that most have forgotten exist. Your grandfather died maintaining the seals that keep the Shadowlands contained. I had hoped that burden would not fall to you. Kyle felt the world shifting beneath him once again. The seals are failing. It would seem so. And if they are, then the old alliances must be renewed. Bonds that were broken by pride and politics must be rewoven, no matter the personal cost. What alliances? Before King Aldwin could answer, a commotion outside the study door interrupted them. Commander Theron's voice carried through the heavy oak, urgent and concerned. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation in the throne room. A delegation has arrived demanding immediate audience with Prince Kyle. Father and son exchanged glances before rising together. Whatever was happening, Kale suspected it was connected to the morning's attack and the larger forces that seemed to be converging on Valdris. The throne room was already filled when they arrived, though not with the usual collection of petitioning nobles and merchants. Instead, a group of figures stood in the center of the great hall, their presence commanding attention and respect from the assembled guards. They wore traveling cloaks that couldn't quite conceal the leather armor beneath, and their bearing spoke of wilderness skills and warrior training. At their head stood a woman Kale didn't immediately recognize, her silver hair braided with blue stones that caught the light from the great windows. She was clearly an alpha, her scent carrying notes of mountain snow and ancient forests, but it was the figure beside her that made Kale's breath catch in his throat. Arya stood among the delegation, but she looked nothing like the mysterious forest dweller he had encountered. Her auburn hair was crowned with a circlet of twisted silver and moonstone, her leather armor bearing the intricate designs of high rank. When she looked at him across the throne room, her storm-grey eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. Your Majesty, the silver-haired woman said, offering a bow that was respectful but not subservient. I am High Alpha Lyanna of the Moonwood clans. We come seeking alliance with the throne of Valdris, as was foretold by the old prophecies. King Aldwin stepped forward, and Kale was surprised to see recognition in his father's eyes. Lyanna Silverborn, it has been many years since the forest clans have sought audience in these halls. Too many years, old friend, but the time for isolation has ended. The seals weaken, and the ancient enemies stir. The Wardkeeper's bloodline must take its rightful place, or all the realms will fall to shadow. Kyle's gaze remained fixed on Arya, his mind reeling with implications he was still struggling to process. She was not just some mysterious Omega he had encountered in the forest. She was part of something larger, something that his family's history was apparently entangled with. And you, Lyanna continued, turning her attention to Kyle, must be Prince Kale Drakemore, the last Wardkeeper. My daughter has spoken of you. Your daughter? Kyle managed to ask, though he already suspected the answer. Arya stepped forward, her chin raised with the same defiant pride he remembered from their first meeting. Hello, Your Highness. I believe we have much to discuss. The throne room fell silent, except for the sound of Kale's heartbeat thundering in his ears. Everything he thought he knew about his encounters with Arya had been turned upside down. She wasn't just some forest Omega who had intrigued him. She was royalty herself, daughter of an alpha who spoke of ancient prophecies and failing seals. And from the way she looked at him, with a mixture of challenge and something deeper, he suspected their story was far from over. Chapter 6. Bonds of Blood and Moonlight. The revelation that Arya was not only royalty but the daughter of a high alpha sent shockwaves through Kyle's understanding of everything that had transpired between them. As the formal presentations continued in the throne room, he found himself unable to focus on the political niceties, his attention drawn repeatedly to the woman who had challenged him in moonlit gardens and forest clearings. The Moonwood clans have maintained the eastern borders for generations, High Alpha Lyanna was explaining to King Aldwin. Our warriors know every tree and stone of the deep forests, every path the shadow creatures might take should they breach the barrier mountains. And in return for this alliance? Aldwin asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The ancient bonds must be renewed. The Wardkeeper bloodline must join with the Forest Guard, as it was in the days before pride and politics drove our peoples apart. Kyle felt the weight of countless eyes upon him as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a political alliance being proposed. It was a mating bond between himself and Arya, couched in terms of ancient prophecies and mystical responsibilities. "With respect, High Alpha Lyanna," he said, stepping forward, "I think this discussion should involve the actual parties being negotiated about." Arya's lips curved in what might have been approval at his directness. "The prince speaks wisdom. Perhaps we might have a more private conversation about these ancient bonds." King Aldwin nodded slowly. "Commander Theron, please escort our guests to the Moonstone Hall. Refreshments and quarters will be prepared for your delegation." He turned to his son. "Kyle, I believe you and Princess Arya have much to discuss." The title hung in the air between them as the throne room began to empty. Princess Arya, not just some mysterious forest dweller, but royalty in her own right, with responsibilities and burdens that might rival his own. "Shall we walk in the gardens?" Arya suggested once they were alone. "I find that important conversations often benefit from moonlight." They made their way through the palace corridors in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The royal gardens were indeed beautiful in the moonlight, the carefully cultivated flowers and manicured hedges creating geometric patterns that spoke of order and control. It was a stark contrast to the wild beauty of the Thornwood, and Kyle found himself wondering which environment truly reflected Arya's nature. "You lied to me," he said finally, as they reached the moonwell where they had met before. "Did I?" Arya settled onto the stone bench, her posture relaxed despite the tension crackling between them. "I told you my name was Arya, which it is. I told you I lived in the forest, which I do. I never claimed to be anything other than what I am. You let me believe you were just some Omega living wild in the woods, and you let me believe you were just some troubled Alpha seeking solitude. We both kept our secrets, Kyle." He couldn't argue with that logic, much as he wanted to. Why? Why approach me at all if this was all leading to some arranged marriage? Arya's expression grew serious, her storm-grey eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Because I needed to know if the man I might be bound to was worth saving. The prophecies speak of a Wardkeeper who has lost his way, whose heart has turned to stone. They say he must remember how to feel, how to trust, or the seals will fail, and darkness will consume all the realms." "And what did you conclude?" She stood and moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell that intoxicating scent of pine and wildflowers. "I concluded that Prince Kael Drakemore is indeed lost." "But Kael the man, the one who seeks peace in wild places and speaks of forests that belong to themselves, he might be worth the risk." Her words stirred something deep in his chest, in places that had been frozen since Ironhold. "You don't understand what you're asking. Everyone I've ever cared about, everyone I've allowed close, ends up dead. I won't be responsible for destroying someone else. He stopped himself before he could finish the thought, but Arya caught the words anyway. "Someone else you what, Kael?" "Someone else I could care about," he admitted quietly. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then you do understand. That's exactly what the prophecy means. The Wardkeeper must open his heart again, must risk caring, or the bonds that protect our world will remain broken. What if I can't? What if I'm too damaged, too broken to be what you need? Then we'll both find out together." Arya's thumbs brushed across his cheekbones, and he realized he was trembling. "But I don't think you're as broken as you believe. I've seen how you look at me, felt how your alpha nature responds despite all your walls. The bonds are already forming, Kael. The question is whether you'll fight them or embrace them." Before he could respond, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate claiming he might have expected. Instead, it was a question, an invitation, a gentle testing of boundaries he had thought impenetrable. For a moment, Kyle stood frozen, every instinct warring between the desire to pull her closer and the need to push her away. Then something deep inside him, something that had been buried since Ironhold, began to crack. He found himself kissing her back, his hands coming up to tangle in her auburn hair, as 3 years of enforced solitude crumbled beneath the gentle assault of genuine connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Cale could see his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "The bond," she whispered. "Can you feel it?" He could. It was like a golden thread stretching between them, warm and alive and terrifying in its intensity. His alpha nature recognized her as his mate, his perfect complement, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to complete the claiming. "Arya," he began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "I know you're scared. I know you think caring about me will somehow doom us both, but the prophecies are clear. Only through renewed bonds can the Wardkeeper fulfill his destiny. And Cale?" She smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. "I'm not some fragile court Omega who will break at the first sign of danger. I'm the daughter of a high alpha, trained in combat and woodcraft since childhood. If you let darkness come for me, I promise to fight it with everything I have." Her words should have terrified him more, should have made him think of all the ways enemies could exploit a mate to hurt him. Instead, he found himself feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. "The attacks in the forest," he said. "The creatures looking for me. Are they connected to all this?" Arya's expression grew grave. "The Shadow Spawn have been testing the borders for months, seeking weaknesses in the ancient wards. They know the Wardkeeper bloodline is the key to maintaining the seals, and they'll do anything to prevent the bonds from being renewed. So by caring about you, by forming this bond, I'm putting you directly in danger." "Yes," she said simply. "And by caring about you, I'm putting myself in the same danger. That's what it means to be mates, Kyle. We face the darkness together, or we fall together." He stared at her in the moonlight, this fierce woman who challenged everything he thought he knew about love and duty and sacrifice. She was offering him something he had thought lost forever. Not just companionship, but true partnership. Someone who would stand beside him not because of duty or political necessity, but because she chose to. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to let someone in again." "Then we'll learn together," Arya replied, taking his hands in hers. "One day at a time, one choice at a time. The bond will guide us, but only if we're both willing to trust it." As if summoned by her words, a howl echoed across the palace grounds, long, mournful, and definitely not from any domestic dog. It was answered by another, and then another, until the night air filled with the song of wolves calling to their pack. "Your mother's people?" Kyle asked. "Some of them. The rest of the Moonwood delegation." Arya's smile held a hint of wildness that made his pulse quicken. "They're singing the old songs, the ones that welcome new bonds between alphas and their chosen mates." "I haven't chosen yet," Cale protested, though the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "Haven't you?" Arya challenged. "Then why are you still holding my hands? Why is your alpha scent calling to me like I'm already yours?" He looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers had interlaced with hers, as naturally as breathing. The truth was undeniable. Some part of him had already made the choice, regardless of what his rational mind insisted. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if we do this, there's no going back. The bond between mates is permanent." "Good," Arya replied fiercely. "I'm tired of temporary things. I want something real, something that will endure no matter what comes." In the distance, the wolves continued their song, and Kyle felt something inside his chest answer their call. For the first time in 3 years, the future held possibilities beyond duty and isolation. It held the promise of connection, of shared strength, of bonds that might indeed be strong enough to hold back the darkness. "All right," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Let's see what these ancient bonds are really about." Arya's smile was radiant as she rose on her tiptoes to kiss him again. This time, there was nothing tentative about it. This time, it was a claiming. Chapter 7. The Price of Ancient Oaths. The War Council convened at dawn in the Obsidian Chamber, its black marble walls carved with protective runes that had glowed faintly since the Moonwood delegation's arrival. Cale stood before a massive map of the kingdom, red markers indicating the latest reports of shadow creature sightings, while his father and the assembled military commanders discussed defensive strategies. "The pattern is clear," Commander Theron was saying, pointing to clusters of markers along the eastern borders. "They're not random attacks. The creatures are testing specific points along the barrier mountains, looking for weaknesses in the ancient wards. High Alpha Lyanna studied the map with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades defending frontier territories. The Moonwood Scouts report similar probing attacks along our borders. Whatever controls these shadow spawn has intimate knowledge of the Ward network. How is that possible? Asked Lord Aldrich. The Wardcraft has been secret knowledge of the Drakemore line for generations. King Aldwyn's expression darkened. Not entirely secret, I'm afraid. There were others who knew the old ways, before the great betrayal fractured the ancient alliances. Kyle looked up from the map, his alpha senses picking up undercurrents of old pain in his father's scent. What betrayal? The reason your grandfather died maintaining seals that should have been shared among multiple bloodlines, Aldwyn replied. The reason the Moonwood clans withdrew to their forests and the Wardkeeper line bore the burden alone. Before anyone could ask for clarification, the chamber doors burst open. Princess Arya strode in, her leather armor gleaming and her face grim with urgent news. Despite the early hour and the serious circumstances, Kyle felt his pulse quicken at the sight of her. The bond between them, acknowledged but not yet fully formed, hummed with awareness whenever she was near. "Forgive the interruption," she said, offering a brief nod to the assembled council. "But our perimeter scouts have returned with disturbing news." "Report," Lyanna commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha addressing her subordinate. "The Shadow Spawn have established a forward base in the ruins of Ironhold. They're using the site as a staging ground for larger incursions into Kingdom territory." The blood drained from Cale's face. Ironhold, the site of his greatest failure, where everyone he had ever loved had died in flames and betrayal. Now the enemy was desecrating that sacred ground, turning the place of his deepest trauma into a weapon against the realm. "How many?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. "At least 24 that we could count, but there are caves beneath the ruins that could hide many more." "And your highness?" Arya's storm-grey eyes met his across the war table. "They have a leader, something that was once human, but has been transformed by shadow magic. It wears the face of someone you once knew." Kyle's hands gripped the edge of the map table so tightly that his knuckles went white. "Describe them." "Tall, with golden hair turned silver by corruption, eyes like ice that once might have been blue. The scouts said it wore the remnants of noble dress, though twisted by dark power." "Lyanna," Kyle breathed, though not the High Alpha standing in the chamber. This was another Lyanna entirely, his former betrothed, the Omega who had died at Ironhold 3 years ago. Except apparently she hadn't died. She had been taken, corrupted, turned into something monstrous. "My son," King Aldwyn said gently, recognizing the signs of Cale's distress. "What aren't you telling us about what happened at Ironhold?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Kyle had never spoken of the details of that night, had carried the guilt and shame in silence for 3 years. But now, with shadow creatures using his past against him, and ancient bonds demanding truth between mates, the walls he had built began to crumble. "She was supposed to be safe," he said finally. "Lady Lyanna of House Silverton. We were to be married in a political alliance between our kingdoms, but over the months of courtship, genuine feeling had grown between us. Or so I thought." Arya moved closer to him, and he could feel the warmth of her presence like an anchor in the storm of painful memories. "The night of the massacre, she sent me a message asking to meet privately in the ruins of the old keep. She said she had discovered something important about the wards, something that couldn't wait. I should have brought guards, should have been more cautious, but I trusted her completely." "It was a trap," Commander Theron said grimly. "The most effective kind, one that used my own feelings against me. When I arrived at Ironhold, I found her there as promised. But she wasn't alone. Shadow creatures had already infiltrated the ruins, and they had been waiting for me. The plan was to capture the last Wardkeeper, to break the bloodline that maintained the seals." Kyle's voice grew rough with suppressed emotion. "I fought them, managed to escape the initial trap, but not before they had slaughtered everyone in the settlement. Men, women, children, all dead because they had been used as bait to draw me out. And Lyanna, what happened to her?" King Aldwyn asked gently. "I thought she died trying to help me escape. I saw her fall, saw the creatures drag her body away. For 3 years I've carried the guilt of her death, believing that my feelings for her had made me careless, that trusting in bonds had gotten everyone killed. But she didn't die," Arya said, understanding the full implications. "She was taken, corrupted, turned into a weapon against you. The perfect psychological torture, High Alpha Lyanna observed coldly. Force him to face the woman he once loved, now twisted into something monstrous. It would paralyze most alphas with guilt and regret. Will it? Arya asked, turning to face Kyle directly. Will seeing her like this break you? The question was blunt, almost brutal, but Kyle recognized it as necessary. If they were to face this enemy together, she needed to know if he would freeze at the crucial moment. 3 days ago I might have said yes, he admitted. But things have changed. I'm not the same man who failed at Ironhold. What's changed? She pressed. Kyle met her eyes, and in them he saw not judgment, but fierce support. The bond between them pulsed with warmth and strength, reminding him that he was no longer facing the darkness alone. I've remembered what I'm fighting for, he said. Not just duty or crown or the abstract concept of the realm. I'm fighting for the chance at a future I thought was lost forever. Arya smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Good, because we're going to need that strength for what comes next. Which is? Lord Aldrich asked. We assault Ironhold, Kael declared, turning back to the war table with renewed purpose. We take back the site and destroy whatever base the Shadow Spawn have established there. But more than that, we use the assault to complete the bonding ritual. The chamber fell silent except for the soft hiss of torches in their wall sconces. My son, King Aldwyn said carefully, are you certain? The bonding ritual between a wardkeeper and their mate is intense. To attempt it in the middle of a battle, the prophecies are clear, High Alpha Lyanna interrupted. The bonds must be forged in fire and shadow, tested by the very forces they are meant to oppose. There is no safe time, no peaceful moment for such a ritual. It must be done in the crucible of conflict. Arya nodded her agreement. My mother speaks truth. The ancient magics require sacrifice, risk, genuine commitment, tested under the most extreme circumstances. If our bond is to have the strength to restore the wards, it must be forged in the place where they were first broken. Then we plan for war, Kyle decided. But this won't be a simple military assault. We'll need the old rituals, the ceremonial weapons, everything required for the bonding. The Moonwood clans have preserved much of the ancient lore, Lyanna assured him. We can provide what is needed. As the council began discussing logistics and battle plans, Arya moved to stand beside Kael at the map table. Her shoulder brushed against his, and he felt the bond between them pulse with warmth and determination. Are you ready for this? She asked quietly. To face your past and choose your future in the same moment. I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this, Kyle replied honestly, but I know I can't keep running from what happened at Ironhold, and I know that whatever we face there, I want to face it with you. Even if it means watching me fight beside you, even if it means risking both our lives for the sake of these ancient bonds. Kyle turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face. Especially then. You're not some fragile thing to be protected, Arya. You're my equal, my partner, my mate. If we're going to save the realm, we do it together, or not at all. Her smile was fierce and proud. I was hoping you'd say that. As the War Council continued their planning, neither Kael nor Arya noticed the shadow that detached itself from the corner of the chamber, slipping away to carry news of their intentions to very interested ears. Chapter 8. The Gathering Storm. 3 days later, the combined forces of Valdris and the Moonwood clans made their way through the Thornwood toward the ruins of Ironhold. It was an impressive sight. Royal knights in gleaming armor riding alongside forest warriors in leather and fur, their banners streaming in the autumn wind. But Kael knew that all their martial splendor would mean nothing if the ancient rituals failed. He rode at the head of the column beside Arya, both of them wearing ceremonial armor crafted specifically for the bonding ritual. His breastplate bore the dragon sigil of House Drakemore worked in silver and obsidian, while hers displayed the silver moon and oak tree of the Moonwood clans. The armor was beautiful, but it was also functional, warded against shadow magic and inscribed with protective runes that had been old when the kingdom was young. The ritual weapons? Kael asked, though he had checked their preparations a dozen times already. Moonblade and Dragonfire, Arya confirmed, patting the wrapped bundle secured to her saddle. Forged in the early days of the alliance between our peoples, blessed by high alphas and wardkeepers alike, they haven't been drawn together in battle for over 2 centuries. Behind them, the combined army moved with grim purpose. Commander Theron led the royal forces while High Alpha Lyanna commanded her forest warriors. King Aldwyn had wanted to come himself, but the council had convinced him that the kingdom needed its king safe, while the heir embarked on such a dangerous mission. Nervous? Arya asked as they crested a hill that gave them their first view of Ironhold in the distance. Terrified, Kyle admitted, but not of the battle or the shadow creatures. I'm terrified of what I might feel when I see her again. The ruins of Ironhold sprawled across a plateau ahead of them, its broken towers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Even from a distance, they could see the wrongness that had taken hold there, shadows that moved independently of their sources, a darkness that seemed to drink in the afternoon light. She's not the woman you remember, Arya said gently. Whatever she was before, the shadow corruption has destroyed that person and left only a weapon behind. I know that logically, but emotions aren't always logical. Arya reached across the space between their horses to take his hand. Then lean on our bond when your emotions threaten to overwhelm you. Let my strength supplement yours, and I'll do the same. The warmth that flowed between them through that simple touch was already stronger than it had been just days before. The partial bond they had formed was growing, preparing itself for the final ritual that would either complete their connection or destroy them both. Movement in the ruins, Commander Theron called out, raising his spyglass to study the distant fortification. Multiple figures on the walls, and something large moving in the central courtyard. Kyle took out his own glass, focusing on the area Theron had indicated. What he saw made his blood run cold. Dozens of shadow creatures moved through the ruins with purpose and organization, but at their center stood a figure in tattered nobility that he recognized all too well. Lady Lyanna of House Silverton had indeed survived Ironhold, but the woman who now commanded the shadow spawn was a twisted mockery of the person he had once cared for. Her golden hair had gone silver white, her once warm blue eyes now glowed with cold fire, and her skin bore the pale, translucent quality of something that had never known sunlight. Most disturbing of all, she moved with predatory grace that spoke of supernatural strength and speed. She knows we're coming, Arya observed, her own glass trained on the ruins. She's positioning her forces for our approach. Good, Kyle said grimly. I'm tired of running from the past. Time to face it head-on. They made camp within sight of Ironhold as the sun began to set, close enough to maintain surveillance but far enough away to avoid immediate attack. As the army settled in for the night, Kyle and Arya retreated to a secluded grove where High Alpha Lyanna had prepared the ritual circle. The ancient symbols carved into the earth seemed to pulse with inner light as darkness fell, responding to the presence of the ceremonial weapons and the approaching completion of the bonding. Moonblade and Dragonfire lay crossed at the center of the circle, their enchanted steel gleaming despite the lack of direct light. The ritual must begin at midnight, Lyanna explained, her voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge, when the veil between worlds is thinnest and the old magics run strongest. You will drink from the bonding cup, speak the ancient vows, and take up the weapons as one. But remember, the bond will not be truly complete until it is tested in battle against the shadow. What exactly will we face once the ritual begins? Kyle asked. The shadow corruption will sense what you're attempting and throw everything it has at you to prevent the bonding. Expect the attack to come from multiple directions and expect your enemies to use every psychological weapon at their disposal. Arya moved to stand beside Kyle at the edge of the ritual circle. Are you ready for this? I've been ready since the moment I kissed you in the moonlight, he replied, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. As midnight approached, they shed their outer garments and entered the ritual circle wearing only simple linen tunics that would not interfere with the ancient magics. The ceremonial cup sat between the crossed weapons, filled with wine that had been blessed by both traditions. Kyle Drakemore, last wardkeeper of the ancient line, High Alpha Lyanna intoned as the ritual began. Do you accept this bond freely, knowing it may cost you your life? I accept it freely, Kale replied, his voice carrying across the grove. Arya Moonwood, daughter of the Forest clans, do you accept this bond freely, knowing it may cost you your life? I accept it freely, Arya answered, her storm-grey eyes never leaving Kyle's face. Then drink, and let your destinies be bound. They lifted the cup together, their hands touching on the ornate silver stem. The wine was sweet and strong, with undertones of herbs and magic that made Kyle's alpha senses sing with recognition. As they drank, power flowed between them, the partial bond they had formed blazing into something far stronger and more complex. "Now speak the ancient words," Lyanna commanded. "By moonlight and dragonfire," they said together, their voices harmonizing in ways that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the earth. "By blood and breath, and the bonds that bind all living things, we choose each other above all others, in this life and whatever may come after." The ritual circle erupted with silver light as their words completed the first phase of the bonding. Power coursed through both of them, alpha and omega natures complementing and strengthening each other in ways that sent shockwaves through the magical fabric of the world. And in the ruins of Ironhold, something that had once been Lady Lyanna of House Silverton threw back its head and screamed with rage and hunger as it felt the ancient bonds beginning to reform. "Take up your weapons," High Alpha Lyanna ordered as the light began to fade. "The shadow knows what you have begun, and it will not allow the ritual to be completed unopposed." Kyle grasped Dragonfire's hilt just as Arya's fingers closed around Moonblade. The moment their hands touched the ceremonial weapons, both blades burst into flames, his burning with the deep red of dragon's breath, hers blazing with silver moonlight. In the distance, war horns began to sound as shadow creatures poured from the ruins of Ironhold, like a black tide, racing toward the grove where the bonding ritual had begun. "The final test begins now," Arya said, her voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of the power flowing between them. Kyle nodded, feeling more complete than he had in years despite the approaching danger. Whatever came next, they would face it together, bonded by choice and magic and the ancient power that flowed in their bloodlines. The Shadow Army reached the edge of their camp just as the moon reached its zenith, and the Battle of the Bonds began in earnest. Chapter 9. Fire and Shadow. The battle erupted with supernatural fury as shadow creatures crashed against the combined forces of Valdris and the Moonwood clans. But at the center of the chaos, within the ritual circle where silver flames danced around crossed weapons, Kyle and Arya fought as if they had been partners for decades rather than days. Dragonfire sang through the air in Kyle's grip, its enchanted blade cleaving through Shadowspawn like they were made of mist. Beside him, Arya moved with deadly grace, Moonblade weaving patterns of silver light that seemed to burn the darkness wherever it touched. The bond between them pulsed with shared strength and awareness, allowing them to fight in perfect synchronization. "Behind you!" Arya called out, spinning to drive Moonblade through a shadow creature that had tried to flank Kyle while he was engaged with two others. He didn't even turn to look, trusting completely in their connection as he continued his assault on the enemies before him. This was what the ancient bonds were truly about, not just romantic connection, but perfect partnership forged in trust and tested in fire. "The ritual circle must be maintained," High Alpha Lyanna shouted over the din of battle. "If the protective wards fail before the bonding is complete, the backlash will destroy you both." Around them, the combined armies held the line with desperate courage. Commander Theron led a charge that drove back a cluster of Shadowspawn, threatening the eastern perimeter, while Moonwood warriors used their intimate knowledge of forest warfare to devastating effect. But for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to emerge from the ruins of Ironhold. "They're trying to overwhelm us with numbers," Kyle realized, parrying a strike from a creature whose claws gleamed with toxic shadow. "This is a distraction." "From what?" Arya asked, even as she beheaded another attacker with a fluid stroke of Moonblade. Her answer came in the form of a voice that cut through the battle's chaos like ice through flame, beautiful, familiar, and utterly wrong. "My beloved Kyle, still playing with fire, I see." The corrupted Lady Lyanna stood at the edge of the ritual circle, having somehow passed through the army's defenses without being detected. Up close, the transformation was even more horrifying than it had appeared through the spyglass. Her once golden hair hung like silver cobwebs around a face that retained its beauty, but had gained the terrible perfection of something that had never known mortality's touch. Her pale skin seemed to drink in the moonlight, and her eyes burned with cold fire that held no trace of the warmth he remembered. "Lyanna," the name escaped Kale's lips like a prayer or a curse. "You remember me." "How touching." Her smile revealed teeth that were too sharp, too white. "Though I go by different names now. The Shadowspawn call me their Silver Queen. Such devoted subjects they make." Arya stepped forward, Moonblade raised defensively. "You're not welcome here, Abomination. This is sacred ground." Sacred? The corrupted Omega laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. This place where your precious bonding began? How ironic. It was here in these very ruins that I learned the true price of trusting an Alpha's promises. That's not what happened, Kyle said, though his voice carried less certainty than he intended. You were trying to help me escape when they took you. Was I? Lyanna tilted her head with predatory interest. Or was I the bait that drew you into their trap? Tell me, beloved, in all these years of guilt and self-recrimination, did you ever wonder why I was so conveniently alone that night? Why I sent you that message at precisely the right moment to deliver you into their hands? The words hit Kyle like physical blows. Around the ritual circle, the battle continued to rage, but his focus narrowed to the terrible possibilities her words suggested. You're lying, Arya said fiercely, her storm-grey eyes blazing with protective fury. You're trying to break his concentration, to corrupt the bonding with doubt and guilt. Am I? Or am I finally telling him the truth his noble heart has been too pure to accept? Lyanna's gaze shifted to Arya with contempt. Did you really think you could replace me so easily, forest whelp? He loved me first, chose me first, promised himself to me before he ever knew your name. I know exactly what I am to him, Arya replied, her voice steady despite the psychological assault. I'm his future, not his past, and I'm not going anywhere. The bond between them pulsed with warmth and certainty, pushing back against the doubt that Lyanna's words were designed to sow. But Chaol could feel the corruption, trying to sink its claws into his mind, using every moment of guilt and self-blame from the past 3 years as a weapon against him. The bonding is almost complete, High Alpha Lyanna called out urgently, but you must focus on each other, not on the past. Focus on each other? The Silver Queen laughed again. When the truth is so much more interesting? Shall I tell you what really happened that night, my beloved? How I was promised power beyond imagining if I delivered the last Wardkeeper to the Shadow's embrace. How I chose that power over your naive affection. No. Chaol's voice was barely a whisper. Yes. I was never your victim, darling. I was your betrayer. Every smile, every kiss, every moment of supposed love, it was all lies designed to position you for the kill. The revelation struck Chaol like a thunderbolt, threatening to shatter everything he thought he knew about the past. If Lyanna had betrayed him willingly, if she had never loved him at all, then his 3 years of guilt and isolation had been built on a foundation of lies. But then Arya's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his around Dragonfire's hilt, and the bond between them blazed with truth that no corruption could touch. It doesn't matter, she said firmly. Whatever she was, whatever she did, that's the past. I'm your present. I'm your choice. I'm your mate. How touching, Lyanna sneered. But bonds built on the ashes of broken trust never last. Watch as I show him exactly what kind of monster his love creates. She moved with inhuman speed, shadow magic coiling around her like living darkness as she struck, but she had made a fatal error. She attacked Arya instead of Kyle, and the moment her claws met Moonblade's silver fire, the true power of the ancient bonds was unleashed. Kyle felt Arya's pain as if it were his own, felt her determination and fierce love flowing through their connection. But he also felt something else, the completion of the ritual, triggered not by ceremony but by the ultimate act of trust between mates facing death together. Power erupted from the ritual circle in waves of silver and crimson light. The shadow creatures attacking the army were instantly vaporized, their forms unable to withstand the purified magical energy. The corrupted Lyanna screamed as the light touched her, her stolen power burning away like mist before the sun. Impossible, she gasped, her perfect features already beginning to crumble. The bonds were broken, the bloodlines were scattered, the old power was lost forever. The power was never in the bloodlines, Kyle said, understanding flooding through him as the bond settled into permanent connection with his mate. It was in the choice to trust, to love, to stand together against the darkness, and that power can never truly be destroyed. The Silver Queen made one final desperate lunge, but she was too late. The bonding was complete, the ancient wards restored, and the shadow magic that had sustained her corruption was already fleeing back to whatever dark realm had spawned it. She crumbled to ash just as the first rays of dawn broke over the battlefield, and with her destruction, the shadow army that had threatened the realm simply ended. In the sudden silence that followed, Kyle and Arya stood together in the center of the ritual circle, their weapons still blazing with purified light, their bond complete and unbreakable. It's over, Arya said wonderingly. No, Kyle replied, pulling her closer as the combined armies erupted in cheers of victory around them. It's just beginning. Chapter 10. Bonds Eternal. 6 months later, the great cathedral of Valdris had never seen such a celebration. The formal wedding ceremony of Prince Kael and Princess Arya brought together nobles from every corner of the realm, but it also included forest clans who had not set foot in the capital for generations, and common folk who had travelled from distant villages to witness the union that had saved their world. Kyle stood at the altar wearing the ceremonial robes of his ancestors, but his attention was entirely focused on the woman walking toward him down the flower-strewn aisle. Arya's wedding dress was a masterwork that combined the finest silks of the royal court with the natural elegance of forest tradition, silver threads woven with living vines, a crown of moonstone and oak leaves, her auburn hair flowing free as it had the first day he met her. But it wasn't her beauty that made his breath catch. It was the way she looked at him, with eyes full of love and laughter, and the promise of adventures yet to come. The bond between them hummed with contentment and anticipation, no longer the desperate connection forged in battle, but something deeper and more joyful. "My lords and ladies," the high priest intoned as Arya reached the altar, "we gather today not merely to celebrate a union between two noble houses, but to witness the renewal of bonds that protect us all from the forces of darkness." King Aldwyn, looking healthier and happier than he had in years, stepped forward with the ceremonial crown that would mark Kael's formal transition from prince to heir apparent. "Do you, Kael Drakemore, accept the responsibilities of the Wardkeeper's line, to guard the ancient seals and protect the realm from all who would threaten it?" "I do," Kael replied, though his eyes never left Arya's face. "And I accept them not as a burden borne alone, but as a duty shared with my mate and equal partner." High Alpha Lyanna, resplendent in her own ceremonial robes, presented Arya with a circlet of twisted silver that marked her as a High Alpha in her own right. "Do you, Arya of the Moonwood, accept the bonds of marriage and the responsibilities they entail, knowing they may require the ultimate sacrifice?" "I do," Arya said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept them freely, as I accepted the man who stands beside me." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of ancient vows and ritual exchanges, but Kael found himself thinking not of the political implications or the historical significance, but of simpler things, the way Arya's hand felt in his, the scent of pine and wildflowers that would forever remind him of that first meeting in the forest, the laughter in her eyes when she caught him wool-gathering during their own wedding. "You may kiss your bride," the high priest announced finally, and the cathedral erupted in cheers as Kael pulled Arya close for a kiss that sealed not just their marriage, but their eternal bond. Later, as the celebration feast wound down and the last of the guests began to depart, Kael and Arya found themselves on the balcony where this entire journey had begun. The lights of Valdris twinkled below them, while above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance. "Any regrets?" Arya asked, settling against his side with a contented sigh. "Only one," Kael replied, his arm tightening around her. "I wish I had been brave enough to accept this bond from the beginning. Think of all the time we wasted dancing around each other." "We didn't waste anything," Arya said firmly. "Everything happened exactly as it needed to. You weren't ready before. You needed to heal, to learn to trust again. And I needed to see the man beneath the crown, to know I was choosing you for yourself rather than for duty." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of their kingdom and feeling the steady pulse of the bond between them. In the months since the Battle of Ironhold, that connection had only grown stronger and more complex. They could feel each other's emotions, sense each other's thoughts, share strength and comfort across any distance. "The Shadowlands have been quiet," Kael observed, though he kept his tone light. Even on their wedding night, the responsibilities of the Wardkeeper line were never far from his thoughts. "And they'll stay that way as long as the bonds remain strong," Arya replied. "Which they will, because we're in this together now. Forever." "Forever," Kael agreed, turning to face her fully. "Through whatever storms may come, whatever challenges we face, whatever darkness threatens the realm." "Speaking of challenges," Arya said with a mischievous smile that made his pulse quicken, "I've been thinking about the succession laws. They're going to need updating soon." "Are they?" Kael asked, though the bond between them was already giving him hints about what she might mean. Well, the realm will need heirs eventually, and I've heard that bonded pairs tend to be particularly productive in that regard. The implications of her words sent heat rushing through his veins. Princess Arya Drakemore, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting, my beloved husband, that we have a wedding night to get to and a future to build together. Everything else can wait until tomorrow. Kyle swept her into his arms, laughing at her delighted shriek as he carried her toward their shared chambers. The bond between them sang with joy and anticipation, and for the first time in his adult life, Kyle looked toward the future with nothing but hope. Behind them, the ancient wards hummed with renewed power, fed by the love and trust between the last wardkeeper and his forest princess. The realm was safe, the bonds were strong, and whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. In the distance, wolves began to howl their ancient songs of celebration, and the sound was answered by the dragons carved into the palace walls, their stone eyes glowing briefly with inner fire. The old magic was stirring again, but this time it spoke of renewal rather than destruction, of bonds that would endure for generations to come. As Kale carried his bride across the threshold of their new life together, the stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if the very heavens were celebrating the love that had saved a kingdom and restored the balance between light and shadow. The Alpha had found his Omega, the Wardkeeper had accepted his destiny, and their bond, forged in fire and shadow, tested by betrayal and strengthened by choice, would burn eternal. In the years that followed, bards would sing of the love story that saved a realm, of the prince who learned to trust and the princess who taught him how. But those who knew them best understood that the real magic had never been in ancient prophecies or mystical bloodlines. It had been in two people choosing each other, again and again, through every trial and triumph that life could offer, and in the end, that choice had made all the difference.